When I think back on my childhood, a few things come to mind. Playing in the woods with my best friend, also known as my sister, playing in the yard with my younger siblings, playing sports with my older brother, and riding my three-wheelers, all the freaking time. Little did I know that these machines that brought me so much joy, that I spent countless hours on, riding through our forest and tipping up on two wheels and driving in circles, little did I know the sale of these machines had been banned by the US government for over a decade. Yet here I was, riding around on an ATV that had been outlawed because it was supposedly a death machine. What's going on with these machines that were insanely popular and then just disappeared? Though we may associate Honda with this type of off-road vehicle, and of course a few other Japanese manufacturers later on, they weren't technically the first to make a three-wheeled ATV. It actually begins in 1967 with a graduate student at the Cranbrook Academy of Arts and Science in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. That graduate student's name was John Plessinger, and his ongoing graduate project was something he called Project Tricart. At this time, ATVs, as we know them, didn't really exist, though the term did exist. There were no four-wheelers or side-by-sides, mainly there was just amphibious machines, usually in six-wheel form, and those weren't exactly fun unless you're ramping them into a pond. And they had limited utility. Snowmobiles and of course dirt bikes were popular, but seasonal, so Plessinger had something interesting and potentially game-changing on his hands. So what started out as a one-semester and then two-semester project would turn into a full-blown business and the birth of an entire off-road segment, a project to turn those six-wheeled amphibious machines into the first three-wheeler. Now this project would grow beyond just a college assignment, and Plessinger would find himself partnered on the project with a company called Sperry Rand. His three-wheeled machine would go on to take many different forms, all under the name Tricart. And these were quite successful. There's little debate that this project and these production units are really the first of their kind, and in many ways, they sparked the three-wheeled off-road revolution. Plessinger is really a brilliant, innovative thinker, and these machines from the late 60s had loads of amazing features, and when you think about how the ATV market would evolve from this time on, whether John's designs would directly impact Honda's three-wheelers, I don't think it's exaggerating to say that John Plessinger is one of the most important but often overlooked figures in off-road development of the past 60 years. The problems he was tackling in grad school with the Tricart are really the same kind of problems that Honda would face with their ATC models. Now, at basically the same time but across the world in Japan, Osamu Takeuchi, Honda's special vehicle engineer, found himself perusing the cluttered R&D shop considering Honda's next big, non-traditional vehicle. Amidst all the weird prototypes created by the department sat a three-wheeled machine with big cushy tires, but having otherwise rather conventional form similar to really a motorcycle. The reason for this specific exploration of the R&D shop by Tak, as he was known, was in response to a recent assignment from the higher-ups to create a new product for American dealers to sell during the winter months. The three-wheeled machine fit the initiative perfect in his opinion. It was capable as a utility machine, and more important, it was pretty dang fun. Tak knew that this little three-wheeler had the potential to not only be useful, it might be able to shake up the entire off-road segment that was really starting to explode at this time. Now, Tak's team had developed this prototype much in the same way Plessinger had. Essentially, 3 instead of 6 wheels were chosen, and they were put together in a sort of triangular form with 1 wheel in the front and 2 in the rear, though other forms were tested by Honda. Not surprisingly, early prototypes of this machine featured motorcycle tires, but Honda found that they chewed up the terrain too much and they just didn't work with their chassis design. They had a breakthrough though when they received a few sets of those balloon-type tires off of the Amphicat 6-wheeler. With a few slight changes, they were able to attach these tires and found that the 3-wheeler was instantly better than anything they'd tried so far. Honda re-engineered the machine at every level to optimize its utility, opting for a thumb throttle instead of the traditional twist grip, which gave better control when hanging off the vehicle, which is kind of something you have to do. Perhaps the ATC 90's best feature was its simplicity. It didn't feature a new engine, the 90cc overhead cam was already a tried and true platform, and the frame was incredibly basic. This helped keep the cost down and ultimately keep the sticker price down. Honda decided to move forward with Tak's prototype, and halfway through 1969, just shortly after the CB750 was released, Honda took 100 test units to the dunes of Pismo Beach, California. Their riders were given the chance to put these machines through their paces and see what they were capable of. Most concluded these odd little machines were entirely more fun than you'd imagined, but getting dealers on board was another task in and of itself. When the ATC 90, or US 90 as it was known at this time, was released by those dealers who opted in, Honda was able to gauge interest, and certain areas, primarily rural, really sold better, not only because farmers found them useful, but they were proving to be cheap and accessible entertainment for families. By 1970, the model became known as the ATC 90 due to Honda's trademarking of the term all-terrain cycle, and quickly, Honda was selling some 10,000 units a year thanks in part to its sub-$600 MSRP. In most regards, despite everything that came before it, the form of the ATC 90 makes it the first of what we know of as a modern ATV, and it's important to note as farmers became one of the largest markets for the ATC, we can also think of it as, in many ways, the predecessor to modern utility vehicles. Through the 70s, Honda's ATC range would really dominate the market. Honda's many patents through these early years made it nearly impossible for competitors to make a similar machine without paying Honda for the rights. Companies like Yamaha wouldn't do that until 1980, but man, were they thankful when they did, as three-wheelers seemingly took over the off-road segment during this time period. The ATC range would grow through this time, from the little brother ATC 70 all the way up to the later sophisticated and more powerful ATC 185, and then of course all the big red models. As with the off-road market as a whole, the 80s was a time of incredible innovation for these three-wheeled ATVs in terms of performance and utility, from shaft drives to 5 and later 6-speed gearboxes to electric start and engine counterbalancers and suspension. Honda really invested massively into the ATC range through its lifetime, and that really paid off, and it's why they ended up selling millions of these. But as the 80s got underway, Honda began to face competition as the other Japanese manufacturers really wanted a piece of that juicy three-wheeled pie. Yamaha and Suzuki worked to build out diverse three-wheeled lineups, and they really hit the small ATV segment with models like, for example, the approachable Yamaha Trizinger, which was a 59cc perfect little first ATV for younger riders. In many ways, though, Kawasaki was the primary competitor to Honda with their bigger, more capable three-wheelers. In 81, they released their first ATV, the KLT 200, and this was a direct competitor to Honda's ATC 185. In complete Kawasaki form, they just skipped over the smaller lightweight segment, though they would make those later on, and instead they just went straight to making the craziest, biggest, fastest ATV ever made at this point, and in many ways it sparked the creation of more performance, one could say race-oriented three-wheeled designs. Kawasaki's performance three-wheeled options would culminate in the KX250 or Takate models. Now that Takate model from Kawasaki put Honda on the defensive, so they took their performance ATV, that is the ATC 250R, that was first introduced back in 81, and they turned it into a fire-breathing race machine. And these were raced. That original model from 81 was an air-cooled 248cc two-stroke single paired to a close ratio 5-speed manual, and that weighed around 300 pounds. This new 250R was on another level for this segment, updated with modern high-performance liquid cooling. It made significantly more power, but it weighed the same as that previous generation. The ergonomics were probably the best ever for this kind of ATV. It had a 6-speed gearbox, could easily surpass 70 miles per hour, which if you've ever gone over 50 on a three-wheeler, you know what I'm talking about. This is crazy. And this bike really dominated ATV racing at this time, though this is kind of the peak of, the green and red rivalry between Honda and Kawasaki for three-wheeled racing. This ATC 250R from 85 was a far cry from the original ATC 90 when you look at them side by side. The final generation of the 250R would also be the final generation of the iconic ATC range as a whole. The 1986 model would be the last, though rumors abound that Honda actually did make a 1987 model, and some dealers even had them in their shops ready to be sold, but Honda demanded that those dealers disassemble them and cut the frames in half. For a storm was rising for the entire off-road segment at this time, and Honda, no doubt the creator and really leader of this segment of ATVs, would have to answer for what was happening. It's hard to believe now, but when the first three-wheeled ATVs were produced and marketed by Honda, vehicle safety standards, but especially recreational vehicle safety standards, weren't really a thing. Some of the states with the strictest regulations today didn't even require the use of seatbelts until the mid-80s. Through the early 70s, helmet laws were becoming a thing, though government regulations in these areas still felt like kind of civil rights infringements. The general public was beginning to consider whether or not it was smart to just let kids ride whatever they wanted with no restrictions at all. For many, the problem began with the ATC 70, Honda's first ATV marketed directly towards kids, featuring paid advertisements showing how fun these machines could be for those younger riders. Part of the logic behind three-wheelers and their appeal to younger riders is that they must be safer than two-wheelers, right? I mean, they don't tip over at a standstill, you don't have to learn how to balance them, so they're just easier and safer. A three-wheeler gives the same impression as a bicycle with training wheels. If that's where you start when learning how to ride a bicycle, then a three-wheeler should be where you start if you're going to someday move up to the more dangerous and difficult to ride dirt bike, right? Well, not exactly. Not only is riding a bike with training wheels virtually useless for riding a bicycle, riding a three-wheeler calls for a specific kind of involvement from the rider. As Fortnine rightly points out in his video on three-wheelers, older and more experienced riders can not only intuitively gauge how to keep a three-wheeler at least on two of its wheels, they have the weight to do so. These early three-wheelers didn't have suspension, and the tires really were the suspension, so it was up to the rider to sort of counterbalance the movement from the terrain. And so riders of all kinds were crashing these things and even dying on three-wheelers. But primarily young people were experiencing it the worst. By the mid-80s, thousands of lawsuits were pouring in, essentially claiming that the manufacturers of these machines were wrongly advertising dangerous, unpredictable ATVs to children. As early as 1984, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission started to investigate the associated hazards of ATVs. In 85, they began regulatory proceedings, and then in 87 and 88, the U.S. Department of Justice represented the commission in a settlement with 5 manufacturers, that is, the 4 big Japanese manufacturers and Polaris, which made up the entire ATV market. A 1988 New York Times article titled "Federal Judge Approves Decree Regulating All-Terrain Vehicles" notes that the sale of three-wheeled ATVs would now be banned by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And this article points to the manufacturers as being really at fault for making essentially an unpredictable machine that would often roll over in situations where it shouldn't. And essentially saying that this was the leading cause of around 1,000 deaths and some 300,000 injuries. And this was all despite the blame really being put on riders by the manufacturers. Because of all this, all four-wheeled ATVs would now come with warning labels, and training would now be required to be provided to those who bought ATVs going forwards, and those ATVs going forward would now only be in four-wheel configurations, and so the three-wheeler was now dead. Interestingly enough, as three-wheelers disappeared, though let's be real, I'm a testament to the fact that they didn't disappear, four-wheeled ATVs really filled the gap in the market that was left over, and injuries and deaths from those four-wheeled ATVs would essentially continue despite readily available training, because the effect of a little four-wheeled machine sitting in front of a child or even a parent is no different than that of a three-wheeler. You think this thing isn't going to just flip, that it's like a car, and though three-wheelers were in a sense a little bit more unpredictable, honestly they just behaved differently, all ATVs can roll over and do roll over. Just 2 years later, Lucinda Sykes, who was a legendary lobbyist for consumer safety legislation, specifically in products for children, she wrote up a short op-ed piece for the New York Times in 1990, citing the ongoing death of more than 100 children per year in the US due to ATV accidents. Though you and I could disagree with all or some of what she calls for in that article, that is really strict requirements for dealers to refuse, selling ATVs to riders under 16, as well as laws prohibiting children from riding ATVs in any form. What we can gather from her op-ed is that three-wheelers weren't entirely to blame. ATV-related deaths weren't really going down much just because we'd banned the three-wheeler, or because we'd added a warning label. Of course, we can thank this overall fearful approach for what we have now with companies like Razor marketing tiny, and I mean tiny little electric dirt bikes the size of like 50cc mini bikes towards riders who are literally too big to fit them. I'm sorry, but how does a dirt bike with a seat height that's basically the same as a CRF 50, how are you required to be at least 13 years old to ride something like that? When I look at this whole story, the rise and then fall of three-wheelers, and I think about whether or not we should consider these machines dangerous for children, and I wonder if maybe I would consider picking up a used ATC for my own kids, I can't help but think about just my own experience, though that is limited. All that said, though, I spent countless hours aboard my own ATC 185 and 200. Sometimes other people would ride my three-wheelers and I would watch them. My brother mainly rode his dirt bikes, but he also rode the three-wheelers and he understood what they were and how to control them. We also had a psychotic friend who was slightly younger than my dad, and he would wheelie our three-wheelers at like 45 miles an hour down our gravel road. But sometimes random kids who either had four-wheelers or dirt bikes, they'd never really been on three-wheelers, they would take off on our three-wheelers and take them over our makeshift dirt ramp, and I could not believe how reckless they were, or how fast they would go, or how they would push them around turns. Even though I was way younger than these guys, I understood these machines so much better than they did. I knew how they worked. I knew that you couldn't just fly around a turn or you would potentially go flying off. You can't just also ramp a suspensionless machine 5 feet in the air. That's just a bad idea. They're simply not made for that, at least the ones that we had weren't. And you can't just go 45 miles per hour over unpredictable terrain. Now, I never rode the later sporting three-wheelers, so I can't really speak for them, but with these three-wheelers that we had, that just wasn't the purpose, and you could tell that when you rode them. They're meant for putzing around pretty slowly. They're really great at climbing hills or rolling over large sticks. They're kind of trailblazers, I used to use them to make paths that we could walk on through all of our brush because they have amazing torque, they're big, they have giant wheels, and yeah, they're never going to hang with a dirt bike. You just kind of had to understand that. Now, if we want to criticize Honda or any other manufacturer for these machines, I would say that we could point out a lack of training for both dealers and those who purchase these machines, and maybe they aren't the best for very small children. Regardless, ATVs were something new at this time, and the risks present on a three-wheeler aren't a whole lot different than that of a four-wheeler. And looking back, it's difficult to see how these companies could have avoided the risks present with this new sport and this new kind of vehicle that we now call an ATV. In many ways, three-wheelers just happened to be the first. If Honda had started with a four-wheeler, history may have looked very different. But in the end, it's always going to be on parents to understand the machines that they put their kids on and understand the risks involved. Just because you have an extra wheel or 2 extra wheels doesn't mean you're at any less of a risk. In fact, you may be at more of a risk because you feel like that extra weight and overall wheelbase means that you can do anything. But every machine is different. Take snowmobiles, for example. They just don't turn like, ATVs that have wheels. You need to understand that or you'll run into a tree. The only time I ever flipped my three-wheeler was when I did something really stupid. It wasn't the machine's fault. I thought that turning sideways on our frozen field at 30 miles per hour would be cool. I thought I would just slide sideways 100 feet, but that's not what happened. And it was entirely my fault for not respecting the machine. Now, currently, it's no longer illegal for these manufacturers to make three-wheeled ATVs, and as the off-road segment continues to grow and we have all sorts of more safety tech that's available on these machines, I would love to see something like the ATC make a comeback. Now, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Let us know in the comments if you have any experience with three-wheelers, and as always, ride safe.